Story 1. I've never been a fearful person. I grew up in Florida, used to driving on deserted roads, crossing storms, and dealing with strangers when I worked the register at a convenience store. Nothing ever truly scared me, until that night. This happened in 2019, when I was driving home after visiting my sister in Orlando. It was a long drive, over 3 hours on the road, but I enjoyed the solitude. My playlist was playing softly. The breeze from the slightly open window was refreshing, and the Kaukai world felt like a safe place. That is, until, out of nowhere, my dashboard started flickering. At first, I thought it was a mistake, but soon the engine sputtered, and my car lost power. I managed to pull over to the shoulder, heart racing, praying that it was just a scare. I tried calling the insurance company, but my cell phone had no signal. That bothered me, but it wasn't desperation yet. I knew eventually some car would pass by. The problem was that after 10 minutes there was nothing but darkness around me. No lights, no sounds except the wind blowing down the empty road. Then I saw headlights in the rearview mirror. Someone was coming. I felt relieved for a second, until I realized that the car slowed down even before getting close to me. It stopped about 50 meters away. No one got out. The headlights were high, illuminating my silhouette inside the car. My stomach twisted. For a while, I just stared at the rearview mirror, waiting for someone to get out of the car. Maybe a helpful truck driver or a lost tourist. But no one got out. The car's engine was still running, the headlights still pointed at me, blinding part of my vision. What really made me uncomfortable was that, even after a few minutes, nothing happened. Who stops like that in the middle of the road without getting out of the car? Without honking, without signaling anything? My hand instinctively reached for the door lock button. I pressed it. A click echoed in the silence of the car. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that the person was probably just deciding whether they should stop to help. But then, the lights of the other car suddenly went out. The engine was turned off. The road was plunged into complete darkness, and all that was left was the silhouette of the parked vehicle behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest. I gripped the phone in my hand, as if that would somehow protect me. It was then that I heard a sound that made me freeze. Footsteps. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if the person was intentionally trying not to make any noise. My car was off. The only sound besides the footsteps was the wind cutting through the empty road. My heart beat so loudly that I could hear the pulsing in my ears. I squeezed the phone in my hand even though I still had no signal. At that moment, I thought about calling 911 just to see if by some miracle the call would connect. But before I could try, I saw the figure, the silhouette of a man, appeared next to my car, right by the driver's side door. He didn't try to knock on the window, didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at me. The only thing visible in the dark was the shape of his face, faintly illuminated by the moon. He wore a cap and a jacket that looked worn out, with dark stains that could have been oil, or something worse. My whole body was frozen. The road was still empty. There was no one I could shout to for help. He crouched a little, trying to peer inside the car. My fingers were so sweaty that I almost dropped the phone. I forced a nervous smile and made a "I'm fine" gesture with my hand, hoping he would understand and leave. But he didn't. On the contrary, he moved closer and finally spoke, his voice muffled by the wind. "Do you need help?" There was something in the way he said it that gave me chills. It wasn't the question itself, but the tone. It sounded wrong, like he already knew the answer, like he was just waiting to hear my voice. I swallowed hard and shook my head, maintaining a tense smile. "No, thank you. I already called for a tow." It was a lie, of course, but I needed him to believe it. He stood there, motionless for a moment. Then he tilted his head slightly to the side, as if evaluating whether I was telling the truth or not. The silence between us stretched on for far too long. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just kept staring at me with that slight tilt of his head, as if studying every detail of me. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I knew that if he tried to open the door, I wouldn't have time to react. Then, he took a step back, but not to leave. He began to circle the car, heading to the passenger side. My breath caught in my throat. What was he doing? My mind screamed at me to start the car and drive away, but what if the engine didn't start? What if I did that and he noticed my hurry, preventing me from leaving? My brain tried to come up with a quick solution as I watched his shadow moving around the car. When he got near the other window, I reached out and locked the passenger door. The sound of the lock echoed through the silence of the road, and for a moment, he froze. Then, with an almost imperceptible smile, he lightly tapped the window with his knuckles. That sound, the soft tap of his knuckles on the glass, gave me a chill worse than if he had pounded on the window. It was as if he was playing with me, testing my reaction. I couldn't breathe for a moment. My instinct told me not to react, not to show fear, but how could I not? He wasn't a good Samaritan offering help. He was waiting for something. What exactly, I didn't know, and that was the scariest part. After a long second, he leaned in a little closer to the glass and said in a tone almost playful, "Are you sure you've called for a tow?" My stomach churned. He knew I was lying. My chest was rising and falling quickly, and my brain screamed for me to do something. That's when a saving sound broke the silence. A pair of headlights appeared on the horizon coming towards me. Another car. He noticed too, and for the first time his posture changed. Without saying anything else, he took a few steps back, shoved his hands in his jacket pockets, and began to walk away slowly, as if he had never been there. I almost cried with relief when I saw that car approaching. As soon as the headlights were closer, I turned on the hazard lights, hoping the driver would notice I needed help. The man beside my car continued walking slowly, in no hurry, as if not wanting to seem suspicious. He returned to his car, opened the door, and before getting in, looked at me one last time. Even from a distance, I could feel that expression on his face. It wasn't anger, it wasn't frustration. It was something worse, as if he were saying, "This time, you got away." As soon as he started the engine, the other car passed me and slowed down, perhaps thinking it was strange for a woman to be alone on the shoulder at that hour. At that instant, the man pressed the accelerator hard and disappeared into the darkness of the road. My body only relaxed when I saw that he had really gone. The driver of the other car stopped a little ahead and got out, a middle-aged man who asked if I needed help. Still shaking, I explained that my car had died and I had no signal on my phone. He offered me a ride to a nearby gas station, and I accepted without thinking twice. At the gas station, I was finally able to call the insurance company and request a tow. While waiting, I asked for a coffee at the convenience store, trying to process what had just happened. The attendant noticed my state and asked if I was okay. I told him, with few details, that a strange man had stopped near me on the road. He frowned and said something that froze me to the bone. There have been reports of a guy like that around here, always on the emptiest roads, always trying to convince someone to get out of the car. But no one knows what happens when someone accepts his help. I swallowed hard and didn't know what to say. When the tow truck arrived, I went back to my car, looked at the side of the road, and felt a deep shiver, as if I was still being watched. I never found out who that man was or what he wanted. But one thing I know, if that second car hadn't appeared, maybe I would have never told this story. Since then, I've never driven alone on the road late at night. Story 2. This happened in 2017, when I still lived in Miami and was attending night classes at a community college. I worked at a cafe during the day and would leave class around 10 p.m. Since I didn't have a car at the time, I took the last bus home every night. I never minded much, though it was late, the streets of the city still had some traffic, and I liked putting on my headphones and tuning out the world. But that night, something was different. As soon as I got on the bus, I noticed it was practically empty except for a man sitting at the back. He was in the last row, leaning against the window, wearing a gray hoodie with the hood pulled over his face. I could barely make out his features, but something about the way he was sitting unsettled me. He was completely still. No phone in his hand, no headphones, not looking out the window, just sitting there, as if he was waiting for something. I chose a seat in the middle of the bus, far enough to not draw attention but not too close. To the front to seem odd. The driver closed the doors, and we were on our way. I tried to ignore the discomfort, but with every stop, something started to make me more uneasy. That man never moved. I started paying more attention to him without meaning to. It was as if my mind was warning me that something wasn't right. The bus was following its regular route, stopping at various points around the city. But that man never moved. Not to look to the side, not to shift position. Nothing. He just sat there, like a statue. The yellowish lights of the bus flickered every now and then, and with each flicker, I felt like he was getting closer, even though he hadn't moved. On the third stop after I got on, a group of 3 teenagers got on, laughing and talking loudly. They sat near the front, not even noticing the man at the back. For a moment, that calmed me. At least now I wasn't completely alone. But when I looked back at the back of the bus, I felt a chill run down my spine. He wasn't looking forward anymore. His body was still in the same position, but now his head was slightly tilted to the side, and it seemed like he was staring directly at me. My first instinct was to look away, pretend I hadn't noticed. Maybe it was just paranoia, maybe I was exaggerating. But as the minutes passed, my anxiety only grew. I could feel the weight of his gaze, even without directly looking at him. I pulled out my phone and tried to distract myself, but the screen reflected part of the bus, and in the reflection, I saw something that made my heart race. He had moved, without making a sound, without me realizing he wasn't in the last row anymore. Now, he was 2 rows closer, still with his head slightly tilted, as if analyzing every movement I made. My muscles tensed. How had he moved so quickly without me noticing? The bus shook as it hit potholes. The group of teenagers kept talking, oblivious to everything. No one seemed to notice that the man was getting closer, little by little. My mind started racing with possibilities. Maybe he was just a strange passenger, someone tired or lost. But something inside me screamed that it wasn't that. I looked at the driver, thinking about changing seats to the front, but I didn't want to draw attention. That's when the bus made a sharp turn, and for a moment, I got a better look at the man's face. His hood slid a little, and my breath caught. His eyes were wide open, fixed on me, but it wasn't a normal gaze. It was empty, distant, as if he was physically there but his mind was somewhere else. He moved again. Not when I blinked, not when I looked away. It just happened. Now he was only 1 row behind me. My whole body tensed. The sound of the bus engine, the teenagers' conversation. Everything was muffled by the sound of my own quickened breathing. I wanted to get out of there. I wanted to pull the cord to get off at the next stop, but an irrational fear held me back. What if he got off with me? The next stop was approaching. I could see the bus stop sign through the window, but my mind was in a dilemma. Press the button and get off, or wait a little longer and see if he did something? My heart told me to get off, but my reason hesitated. If he was really following me, stopping in an isolated place might be even worse. I took a deep breath and decided to wait 1 more stop, hoping that someone else would get on and break that suffocating tension. But then, without warning, I felt something that made my stomach drop, a slight movement behind me. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I knew what it was. He had leaned forward. I could feel his presence so close that it seemed like the air between us had changed. My body went rigid. I didn't want to turn around to look, but every fiber of my being told me he was right behind my shoulder. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it in the back of my head. That's when he finally spoke, in a low tone, almost a whisper. "You're getting off now, right?" My whole body went cold. His voice was low, hoarse, almost gentle, but in a way that made my skin crawl. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat was dry, as if any word I tried to say would come out shaky, betraying my fear. Instead, I pressed the stop button. Even though I hadn't planned it, I knew I needed to get off immediately. The bus began to slow down, and at that moment, I gathered the courage to slightly turn my head. He wasn't leaning forward anymore. He was sitting up straight. Again, with that fixed stare, but now he was smiling. The bus door opened. Without thinking, I stood up and went straight for the exit, trying to keep a normal pace so it wouldn't look like I was running away. As soon as I stepped onto the sidewalk, the bus started moving again. But before the door closed completely, I heard one last whisper from inside. "See you soon." The door shut, and the bus disappeared down the street. My chest was rising and falling rapidly. I looked around, trying to orient myself. Only then did I realize I'd gotten off in a neighborhood I didn't know. And worse, there was no one else on the street. The silence around me was deafening. I was standing under a flickering streetlight, and all I could hear was the wind whistling through the empty streets. I took out my phone and tried to call an Uber, but my hand was shaking so much I almost dropped it. When I finally opened the app, I felt a chill in my stomach. There were no cars available in the area. I was alone. I took a deep breath and started walking quickly in the direction that seemed to lead to a bigger avenue. My instincts screamed for me to get out of there as fast as possible. After a few minutes of walking, I saw a small neighborhood market still open. The yellow light shone on the sidewalk, and just seeing a place with people made my heart slow down a little. I went inside and approached the cashier, an older man with gray hair and a tired expression. Before I could say anything, he looked me up and down and frowned. "You got off the last bus, didn't you?" My blood ran cold. I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. How did he know? Before I could ask, the man sighed and shook his head, as if he had seen this before. He looked out at the street behind me and murmured something that made me shiver from head to toe. "You were lucky to have gotten off. Not everyone notices in time." My heart raced. I wanted to ask more, to understand what he meant by that, but before I could open my mouth, a car stopped outside. My Uber. I didn't hesitate, thanked him quickly, and ran into the car. As soon as I sat down, I locked the door. The driver gave me a strange look through the rearview mirror, probably noticing my state of nerves, but didn't ask anything. He just started driving. I had never been so relieved to see the familiar lights of my neighborhood coming closer. To this day, I don't know what that man on the bus wanted. All I know is that, since that night, I never took the last bus home again. Story 3. Moving into an apartment by myself was one of the things I had been looking forward to the most in my life. In 2021, I finally managed to save enough money to leave my parents' house and rent a small studio in Tampa. The place wasn't anything luxurious, but it was mine, and that was all that mattered. During the first few days, I was excited, decorating every corner and enjoying the peace of not having to share space with anyone. But that feeling didn't last long. The first strange thing I noticed was the noise. Every night between midnight and 1 a.m., I would hear heavy footsteps from the apartment above. The problem? My apartment was on the top floor. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was just the building creaking, something common in old constructions. But then the footsteps started following a pattern. It was always the same. They would start on the ceiling of my bedroom, walk slowly to the kitchen, and then return. Never a random sound, always the same route. I even mentioned it to a neighbor in the hallway, a guy named Eric who lived on the floor below. He laughed and said, "If it were an old building, fine. But this building is only 5 years old. Have you asked the building manager?" The next day, I took advantage of getting off work early and stopped by the building manager's office. He was a man in his 50s named Mr. Carter, always very polite. I casually asked who lived in the apartment above mine, expecting to hear that it was an old resident or someone who liked to walk late at night. But the answer he gave me made my stomach sink. "No one lives there. That apartment has been empty for months." I stood still for a moment, processing what he had said. I tried to argue, telling him I heard footsteps every night, but he just shrugged. "The last person who lived there left last year. Since then, we haven't rented it to anyone else. But if you're hearing something, I can ask maintenance to check it out." I thanked him and left. But my mind was racing. How could an empty apartment have such distinct sounds of footsteps? That night, I was determined to find out what was happening. I stayed up late, sitting on the couch with the lights off, waiting for the sound of the footsteps to start. Exactly at midnight, there they were. The same pattern as always, starting on the ceiling of my bedroom, walking to the kitchen, then coming back. But this time, there was something different. A slight dragging sound, like something was being pulled across the floor. My chest tightened. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it on the ceiling. Of course, I couldn't see anything, but just imagining what could be happening up there sent a shiver down my spine. Without thinking too much, I decided to do something I might regret. I grabbed a broom and knocked hard on the ceiling 3 times. The sound echoed through the apartment. Seconds of silence. My heart was pounding in my chest. Then, out of nowhere, 3 knocks came back. My blood ran cold. I hadn't expected a response. My whole body froze for a few seconds, trying to process what had just happened. This wasn't a random noise from the building. It wasn't wood creaking. Someone, or something, had answered me. I gripped the broom tightly, my breathing quickening. I tried to convince myself it was just an echo, but I knew it wasn't. That was intentional. My instinct told me to leave the apartment, but my legs felt glued to the floor. Then something worse happened. Slowly, very slowly, the footsteps started again. But this time, instead of following the usual path, they stopped directly above me. I couldn't see anything, but I felt like something was watching me. And then came the sound that made my heart race. A long scratching, very slowly crossing the ceiling from one side to the other, as if nails were scraping the wood above my head. That was enough to make me jump up and run to the door. My brain couldn't formulate a plan, I just knew I needed to get out of there. But the moment I unlocked the door, something made me stop. A simple, terrible thought. What if whatever was up there wanted exactly that? What if, by leaving, I was walking right into its trap? My heart was pounding in my chest as I tried to think about what to do. I didn't want to sleep there, but I also didn't want to run out into the night like a crazy person. I decided to stay on the couch, but with my eyes wide open. I turned on the TV, trying to create some ambient noise to calm my nerves. But from time to time I would hear that scratching sound, as if something was waiting for me to react. Nothing else happened that night, but when the sun finally started to rise, I made a decision. I needed to go up to that apartment. The next morning, I went straight to the building manager's office and asked for the key to the apartment above. Mr. Carter looked at me with suspicion, but after some insistence, he handed me the key, telling me that if I found anything wrong, I should let maintenance know. I climbed the stairs with my heart pounding, my hands sweating as I held the key. When I stopped in front of the door, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something inside me screamed to turn back and forget about it, but my curiosity won over my fear. I turned the key in the lock and pushed the door open. The apartment was completely empty, as expected. The floor, covered in dust, indicated that no one had been there for a long time. But then, as I took a few steps inside, I noticed something that made my breath catch. On the floor, right in the center of the room, there were marks of footprints, clear footprints in the dust, as if someone had walked there the night before. And worse, the marks didn't lead to the entrance door. They came from the middle of the room and stopped exactly above my apartment. My feet froze in place. I looked around, trying to find some logical explanation, but there were no furniture, no signs of forced entry, and most importantly, there was no other way to enter or exit that apartment. The footprints just started out of nowhere and stopped exactly at the spot where I had been hearing the footsteps every night. My breathing became irregular, and I felt a primal fear take over me. That's when a faint sound made me hold my breath. A creak, coming from the ceiling, right above me. My whole body tingled. Was there something above this floor? Didn't the building only have 5 floors? Slowly, I looked up at the ceiling, trying to hear more, but the silence was now absolute. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there, and that's exactly what I did. I rushed out of the apartment, locked the door, and returned the key to the building manager without saying a word. I never mentioned it again. In the following days, the noise stopped completely. No more footsteps, no more scratching. As if now that I had entered that apartment, it was all over. But the feeling of being watched never disappeared. A few weeks later, I moved to another place. I never found out what happened in that apartment. But one thing is certain. If you ever hear footsteps from the floor above and you know no one is living there, don't try to find out what it is. Story 4. This happened in 2018 when I was driving from Jacksonville to Miami after a holiday with my family. I had made this trip a few times before, so I wasn't too worried. My car had a nearly full tank of gas. The road was quiet, and I just wanted to get home before dawn. But around 2 a.m. I started to get sleepy and decided to stop for some coffee. That's when I saw one of those small roadside gas stations, the kind of place that seems like it's stuck in time. Yellowish lights flickering, a rusty gas pump, and a convenience store that was practically empty. I parked the car and got out to stretch my legs. The only other car in the parking lot was an old blue sedan which looked abandoned. I went into the store and headed straight for the coffee machine. inhaling the strong smell of wet cardboard and cheap disinfectant. The place was empty except for the attendant behind the counter, a man in his 60s, thinning hair, and an expression that seemed a little too attentive. He had been watching me the moment I walked in, without saying a word. I gave a half smile and kept stirring my coffee, trying to ignore the strange feeling that he was paying too much attention to me. As I stirred my coffee, I felt an odd silence stretch out in the store. Normally, in places like this, the attendant at least pretends not to be paying attention to you. But this man didn't take his eyes off me. It was like he was studying me. I tried to ignore it and went to the fridge to grab a bottle of water. That's when he finally spoke, his voice raspy and low. "Where are you heading?" The question caught me off guard. It wasn't a simple, "Good evening" or "Need anything else?" It was direct, almost invasive. I hesitated before responding. "To Miami." The attendant frowned as if he didn't like my answer. He looked at the clock on the wall, then out the window at the empty road. Then he said something that made a chill run down my spine. "You'd better wait a bit before getting back on the road." My first reaction was to laugh, thinking he was joking, but his gaze remained serious. The atmosphere in the store seemed to grow heavier. I looked outside. The road was completely deserted, only lit by the faint glow of the station's lights. I didn't see anything unusual. No cars passing by, no signs of danger. Then I turned back to him and asked, trying to sound casual, "Why?" He took a second to answer. Then he lowered his head slightly and said in a quieter tone, "I just think it's not a good time to hit the road." The way he said that made a shiver run down my spine. It wasn't a generic warning, like he was concerned about a deer crossing the road or a drowsy trucker. There was something more to it, something he knew, but didn't want to say outright. My instinct told me not to ignore the warning, but my reason fought against it. Maybe it was just an eccentric old man trying to scare me, or worse, someone trying to delay me for some weird reason. I decided to press on. "What do you mean? What's on the road?" The attendant pressed his lips together as if he was debating whether or not to tell me. Then he sighed and looked me straight in the eyes. "Some people who stop here late at night don't make it to their destination." My stomach sank. There was something in the way he said that made me feel a real fear. It wasn't superstition. It wasn't a generic warning. It felt like a certainty. My mouth went dry. The way he said it didn't sound like a random piece of advice or a trucker's tale to scare travelers. It sounded like a fact. I tried to laugh, but the sound came out weak. "You're kidding, right?" He didn't laugh. He just looked out the window as if waiting for something to appear on the road. Then he murmured almost to himself, always at the same time, always in the same direction. My heart raced. This had happened before. Something happened on that road, and he knew it. But before I could ask more, he leaned over the counter and spoke, this time urgently. "Just do me a favor. If you see headlights in your rearview mirror that don't pass you, don't stop." I wanted to ask more. I wanted to understand what he meant by that, but my throat was dry, and my mind was spinning. A million possibilities rushed through my head. A car following travelers? Someone forcing drivers to stop? Some kind of ambush? Before I could react, he simply turned his back and began organizing some boxes behind the counter, as if the conversation was over. For a moment I considered following him and pressing for more answers, but a bad feeling washed over me. Something inside me told me I didn't want to know more than that. I grabbed my coffee, paid quickly, and left the store, feeling a bit of relief as I breathed in the cold night air. However, as I walked back to my car, one question kept hammering in my mind. What if he wasn't trying to scare me? What if he was trying to save me? I started the car and sat still for a few seconds, looking at the dark road ahead of me. I could just wait a bit longer at the station, but the idea of staying in that empty parking lot with the attendant watching me made me feel even more uneasy. I shifted into gear and returned to the road. The radio played softly, but I wasn't paying attention. My mind was fixated on what he had said. If you see headlights in your rearview mirror that don't pass you, don't stop. For a while, everything seemed normal. The road was long and solitary, surrounded by stretches of forest and a few scattered gas stations. My body started to relax. Maybe that had just been an old man trying to play a prank on me. But then, I noticed something in the rearview mirror. Headlights. At first, I didn't think much of it. Just another car on the road. But the minutes passed and it didn't pass. Even when I slowed down a little to let it go by, nothing happened. It just stayed there, keeping the same distance, like a shadow following me. My chest tightened. I remembered the attendant's words, and my fingers clenched tightly on the steering wheel. I swallowed hard and kept my eyes fixed on the road. I wasn't going to stop. I wouldn't even blink. I drove for a few more miles like that, my heart racing, feeling the sweat trickle down my back. Then, without warning, the headlights simply disappeared. There was no curve, no exit. The car behind me just vanished. I arrived in Miami at dawn. I never knew what happened on that road, nor if the attendant had. Seen other drivers make it out safely like I did. But one thing I know, if you ever find yourself driving late at night in Florida and see headlights in your rearview mirror that don't pass you, just keep driving. Story 5. This happened last year, when I had to make a last-minute trip to Tampa for work. Since the meeting would end late and I was exhausted, I decided not to hit the road at night and instead stopped at a roadside motel to sleep. It wasn't the kind of place I would normally stay, but it was cheap. There were vacancies, and honestly, I just needed a few hours of rest before continuing my journey. The attendant was an older man with graying hair and a tired face, who spoke little and seemed eager to finish his shift as quickly as possible. I took the key to room 107 and walked down the narrow hallway to the door. The motel had that strange smell of old carpet and cheap disinfectant. As soon as I entered the room, I felt an uncomfortable chill. There was nothing unusual about the room, just a double bed, a dresser, an old TV mounted on the wall, and an armchair in the corner. But something in the air felt stagnant, like I had entered a place where no one had stepped in a long time. I closed the door, locked the extra latch, and tried not to think too much about it. I took a quick shower, changed clothes, and threw myself onto the bed ready to sleep. But sleep didn't come. Because out of nowhere, at exactly 2 a.m., I heard knocks on the door. The knocks weren't loud, but they weren't hesitant either. They were rhythmic, calculated, 3 sharp raps against the wood as if whoever was on the other side knew I was awake. My body tensed immediately. I looked at the clock on the nightstand. 2:03 a.m. Who knocks on the door of a motel room at this hour? I tried to convince myself it was someone who had confused the room. It happens all the time, right? But something inside me screamed that it wasn't that. There were no voices, no footsteps of someone walking away after realizing the mistake. Just silence. A silence so dense it felt like it was pressing down on my chest. Then, before I could react, the knocks started again. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks. Like it was waiting for me. My mouth went dry. I could just ignore it, right? Pretend I was sleeping and wait for the person to leave. But there was something strange about the persistence. This didn't seem like a mistake. I sat up in bed, making no noise, and waited. The knock stopped. I sighed in relief. But then the doorknob moved. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. Someone was trying to open the door. First, it was a subtle movement, like a test. Then, the doorknob turned with more force, as whoever was there was starting to get impatient. I slowly got up, not knowing what to do. My eyes went straight to the security chain on the door. It was locked. But was it enough? Whatever was on the other side seemed determined to get in. My breath was stuck in my throat. I tiptoed toward the door and looked through the peephole, my heart hammering in my chest. But the hallway was empty. There was no one there. The blood froze in my veins. This didn't make sense. I had heard the knocks. I had seen the doorknob turning. I swallowed hard and stood still, waiting for any sign of movement from the outside. That's when I noticed something worse. Even though I didn't see anyone, I felt a presence on the other side. I don't know how to explain it, but it was like something was there, standing, waiting. The instinct inside me screamed not to open the door. I took a step back and stayed there, motionless. The silence lasted for long seconds. Then, without warning, the knocks came again. But this time, it wasn't at the front door. It was at the closet door inside the room. My body froze. A shiver ran down my spine, and I felt my stomach turn. The knocks were coming from inside the room. I couldn't move, my brain refusing to process what was happening. Slowly, I turned my head toward the closet. The door was closed, just like it was when I first entered. But now, something inside it was knocking. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks. The same pattern as the door. My heart was beating so fast it hurt. Who or what was inside there? I knew the right thing to do was to leave that room, run to the reception, but my body wouldn't obey. Every part of me was telling me not to open that door, not to look. But then, without me doing anything, the closet doorknob started to turn. Seeing that doorknob turn, slowly and without hurry, was the most terrifying thing I've ever witnessed. Something inside that closet wanted to come out, and I was alone, locked in with it. My body finally reacted, and I backed away toward the exit door, my hand trembling as I tried to unlock the chain. But my fingers were sweaty, slipping on the metal. The closet doorknob kept turning, and then it stopped. The silence was even worse. My chest was rising and falling rapidly, waiting for a new sound, waiting for anything. The air in the room felt heavier, as if something was watching me. Then the silence was broken by a whisper, low, coming from inside the closet. "I know you're there." I've never felt such paralyzing fear in my life. The voice inside the closet didn't sound human. It was low, drawn out, as if someone were whispering with a smile on their lips. My legs finally reacted, and I yanked the door's latch with all my strength, unlocking it in one motion. I opened the door and ran into the hallway without looking back. My heart felt like it was going to explode. The cold fluorescent light of the hallway never seemed so welcoming. I went straight to the reception, still panting. The attendant looked at me as if he already knew what I was going to say. Before I could say anything, he sighed and murmured, "Room 107 again." My eyes widened. Again? What did he mean by that? I immediately asked what was going on there, but he just shook his head and, without saying another word, handed me the key to another room. I wanted answers, but I didn't stay to ask. I grabbed my things and left that motel without looking back. To this day, I never found out what happened in that room. I'll never know who or what knocked on the door. First on the front door, then inside. But one thing I know, if you ever stay at a roadside motel and in the middle of the night, someone knocks on your door for no reason, don't open it. And most importantly, never ignore it if the knocking starts coming from inside. Story 6. I've always enjoyed running at night. Since I moved to Orlando, it became a habit. I'd put on my headphones, go for a run around the neighborhood, and feel the night breeze relieve the stress of the day. I never felt afraid, never worried. My neighborhood was quiet, well lit, safe. At least that's what I thought until that night. I was already halfway through my route when I noticed something strange. On one of the less busy streets, there was a man standing under a streetlight. He didn't seem to be waiting for a bus nor looking at his phone. He was simply standing there, unmoving. The yellowish light from the street lamp flickered from time to time, casting strange shadows on the ground. My first instinct was to ignore him. People standing on the street aren't uncommon, right? But as I passed him, I felt something that made me shiver from head to toe. He didn't move, not a centimeter. I kept running, trying not to look directly at him, but the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave my mind. My body reacted strangely, like it was warning me not to approach. Still, I passed by the streetlight without slowing my pace. My eyes caught a quick detail. He was wearing dark clothes, a jacket too heavy for the Florida heat, and his face was slightly tilted down, hidden by the shadow of his hood. But the worst part was realizing that as I moved away, he didn't look back, didn't follow me, didn't do anything. He just stayed there, frozen, like a statue. I tried to shake off the unease and kept running. After a few more minutes, I made my usual loop around the block before turning back down the same path. I had almost forgotten about the man when I turned the last corner. That's when my heart stopped. The streetlight was still flickering in the distance, casting light and shadow over the sidewalk. The man was still there, but now there was something different. My chest felt heavy, as if my body had sensed the danger before my mind could process it. Something had changed. I looked closer, trying to understand what it was, and then I realized he hadn't moved. He hadn't changed position, but his feet were turned the other way. I don't know how to describe the feeling that took over me in that moment. It was like my brain was trying to find a logical explanation for something that simply didn't make sense. I knew exactly how he was before. His feet pointed toward the street. Now they were facing the opposite direction, but his body was still facing forward, as if his feet had turned on their own without the rest of him moving. A chill ran down my spine. I was frozen, trying to process what I was seeing. My eyes slowly moved up from his feet to his face, but he was still tilted downward, the shadow of his hood hiding any trace of expression. The streetlight flickered again, and for a moment, I swear I saw a smile. Not a normal smile, but something too wide, distorted, like his mouth was stretching more than it should. My body went into alert mode. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn around and get out of there, but what if he followed me? The thought of turning my back on him terrified me. I did the only thing I could think of. I kept running, but this time on the other side of the street, away from him. I passed by the streetlight without looking directly at it, keeping my focus on the path ahead. But when I was already a few meters away, I felt something that made my blood run cold. His footsteps were now echoing behind me. My heart raced. He was following me. But the footsteps weren't hurried, weren't desperate. They were rhythmic, perfectly synchronized with mine, as if he knew exactly how fast I was running and wanted to keep pace with me. That terrified me even more. It wasn't someone running after me to catch up. It was someone who already knew where I was going. I blinked several times, trying to control the panic. The street was still empty, with no cars passing by, no houses with lights on. It was just me and him. My instincts screamed not to look back, but curiosity was stronger. I risked a quick glance over my shoulder and almost tripped. He was still in the same position. His body didn't move, but his feet were closer, as if he had gotten closer without taking a single step. That was impossible. He wasn't walking, I saw with my own eyes, but somehow he was closer. My body went into survival mode. I knew I couldn't keep running without a plan. I needed to get out of there, find a house with lights on, a store that was open, anywhere with another person besides me. I forced myself to breathe deeply and turned abruptly onto the next street, trying to lose him. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran, turning corners without looking back. I was almost home, only 2 streets left. That's when I saw it. At the end of the next corner, illuminated by another flickering streetlight, he was there, already waiting for me. My body stopped before I could react. How? I had turned onto another street, taken a different route. There was no way he could have gotten there before me. But he was there, standing as before, and this time his feet were turned in the right direction. My chest was rising and falling rapidly, my mind refusing to accept what I was seeing. He couldn't be there, but he was. The weak light of the streetlight flickered again, and in that brief moment of darkness, my body froze, because he had gotten closer. 1 second of darkness, and somehow he was closer than before, without moving, without the sound of footsteps. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran like I had never run in my life, turning down another street, not looking back. My only goal was to get home. I saw my building in the distance, my legs burning with exhaustion, but I kept going. When I finally reached the door of my apartment, I went inside, locked all the doors, and collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. I was safe. At least, that's what I thought. That night, even after everything, curiosity was stronger than fear. I went to the window, still with my heart pounding, and looked out at the street. The streetlight was still flickering, and there, right under it, he was still standing, looking directly at my window. I never went for another night run, never passed that street again, and to this day, every time I see a flickering streetlight in the darkness, I feel like somewhere, he's still waiting for me. Story 7. This happened last year, when I was leaving a bar in Miami around 3 a.m. I wasn't drunk, but I was definitely too tired to drive, so I called an Uber. The driver arrived quickly, a clean black sedan, with one of those artificial vanilla air fresheners that linger in the air. I got in the car, gave a polite good evening to the driver, and leaned back in the back seat, ready to just relax until I got home. The ride started normally. The car glided through the quiet streets of Miami, and I absent-mindedly watched the building lights passing by the window. It was only after a few minutes that I noticed something strange. The driver kept glancing at the rearview mirror. At first I thought he was just checking the traffic, but the longer it went on, the more I realized that he wasn't looking at the road. He was looking at me. My body tensed. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my phone screen, but every few seconds I saw his eyes in the rearview mirror. But there was something stranger than his fixed gaze. He wasn't looking directly at me. His gaze was slightly above, as if he were observing something behind me. A chill ran down my spine. The back seat where I was sitting was small, and there wasn't much space. If there had been anyone else in the car, I would have felt it. Slowly, as if I were just stretching, I turned my head slightly to look through the reflection in the window. The back seat was empty. Nothing there. But the driver's gaze in the rearview mirror remained fixed, exactly at the same point. My stomach dropped. Something was wrong. The driver kept staring into the rearview mirror, and no matter how much I tried to convince myself it was just my paranoia, I felt a presence there. The air inside the car felt heavier, suffocating. My skin crawled as if someone were sitting next to me, breathing slowly. Finally, I broke the silence. "Is everything okay, man?" The driver took a moment to respond. His gaze stayed fixed on the rearview mirror for a few more seconds before he slowly turned his head to look at me. His expression was tense, pale. When he spoke, his voice came out low, almost a whisper. "Don't move." My heart raced. Don't move? What did he mean by that? My muscles froze immediately. The silence inside the car became deafening, and the only thing I could hear was my own rapid breathing. The driver kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, gripping the wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "There's someone in here," he whispered, barely moving his lips. My body went cold. I wanted to turn around, wanted to see what he was seeing, but something inside me screamed not to do that. My whole body was paralyzed, my mind refusing to accept what was happening. The driver blinked a few times, swallowed hard, and pressed the pedal, speeding up as if he wanted to get away from there. The car shot down the road, streetlights flashing by too quickly outside the window. I was caught between the fear of asking and the terror of already knowing the answer. My hands were sweating, my stomach in knots. Finally, I risked a whisper. "What are you seeing?" The driver didn't respond immediately. His eyes were still fixed on the rearview mirror, his face tense, as if trying to pretend that nothing was there. But then, almost without moving his lips, he murmured, "Don't look back. If you pretend you don't see, maybe it will go away." I felt a shiver so intense that my skin burned. He? My heart pounded in my chest. The adrenaline making me feel nauseous. Someone, or something, was sitting with me in the back seat. My mind screamed at me to get out of the car, but how? We were going fast, no cars around, no safe exit. The driver stayed tense, his eyes glued to the rearview mirror, as if monitoring every movement of whatever was behind me. I wanted to look. My instinct told me not to. The silence in the car was suffocating. The strong vanilla scent seemed even more intense, like the very air was becoming denser. My body was rigid, my breathing shallow and rapid. Then, out of nowhere, I felt something that made my blood freeze. A light tug on my shirt, like something was trying to get my attention. My whole body shivered. Someone had really touched me. It was a weak pull, almost childish, but the feeling of cold fingers brushing against the fabric of my shirt was enough to make me want to scream. My hands trembled in my lap, my mouth dry, and all I could do was not look. That's when the driver did something unexpected. Without warning, he slammed on the brakes. The car skidded, my shoulders hit the front seat, and for a second, everything went silent. No weight, no touch, nothing. My heart was still pounding when the driver slowly looked at the rearview mirror once more and let out a heavy sigh. "It's gone." I didn't ask anything. I just got out of the car as quickly as I could when we reached my destination. The driver stayed still for a while, staring at the back seat before finally meeting my gaze. With a tired look, he only said, "Next time you get into an empty car, make sure it's really empty." Story 8. In 2020, a coworker asked me for a favor. She was going on a trip for a week and needed someone to take care of her house in Tampa, water the plants, feed the cat, and make sure everything was in order. I lived in a small apartment and thought that spending a few days in a bigger house would be a good break. I agreed without hesitation. The neighborhood was quiet, safe, and her house was spacious and well lit. On the first day, everything was normal. I cooked, watched TV, and even played with the cat. But by the second night, I began noticing small things out of place. First, it was the doors. I was absolutely certain I had closed the bedroom door before going to sleep, but when I woke up, it was ajar. I thought maybe the cat had pushed it open, but when I went to check, he was sound asleep on the couch. Then, the kitchen light. I turned it off before going to bed, but when I came back in the middle of the night to get a drink of water, it was on. I wanted to believe it was just my distraction, but something bothered me, the strange feeling that I wasn't alone. On the third night, I began to feel genuinely uncomfortable. Every time I walked through the house, I felt a strange weight in the air, like someone was watching me. I started paying more attention to the details, trying to find explanations for the small changes that kept happening. That's when I noticed something that made me freeze. The back door, which I was sure I had locked, was unlocked. My first thought was that maybe my coworker had come back without telling me, forgotten something. I grabbed my phone and sent her a message, trying to sound casual. "Hey, did you stop by today?" The back door was open. The reply came a few minutes later, and it made me feel even worse. "No, but you locked everything, right?" I swallowed hard. I had locked it. At least I thought I had. But if I had locked it, who opened it? That night, I decided I wasn't going to sleep. The unease had turned into real fear, even though I tried to convince myself it was all just coincidence. I locked myself in the bedroom and lay in bed with the cat curled up next to me, listening to the sounds of the house. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were slow, careful, coming from the hallway. The sound was muffled, like someone was walking barefoot on the wooden floor. My heart raced. I was alone in the house. The cat, previously calm, curled up and began growling softly, his eyes fixed on the door. My hands went cold. I gripped my phone tightly, not sure whether to call someone or try to convince myself it was just my imagination. But the footsteps didn't stop. I held my breath, trying to hear better. The footsteps were now closer, stopping just on the other side of the door. The cat arched his back, ears down, fur bristling as if he was ready to pounce. Then, the doorknob moved. It was a subtle movement, but unmistakable. Someone was trying to open the door. My body froze, and an irrational panic overtook me. My first instinct was to throw myself against the door, gripping the doorknob with all my strength. But whoever was on the other side stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the footsteps. Time dragged on, every second crawling by. And then, after a long moment of pure terror, I heard the most terrifying sound of the night. A whisper, soft, pressed against the wood of the door. I couldn't understand what was said. It was a dragged whisper, too low to distinguish words, but loud enough to send a cold shiver down my spine. I stayed completely still, my heart pounding so loudly I thought whatever was on the other side of the door could hear it. The cat was now arched, growling softly, eyes fixed on the crack under the door. He saw something there. My mind screamed at me to get out of that room, but my body was paralyzed by fear. Then, after a few seconds of absolute silence, something even worse happened. The doorknob turned again. But this time, it turned slowly. No rush, as if whoever was there knew I was listening. I swallowed hard and finally did what I should have done earlier. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. My hand was shaking so much I almost dropped the phone. When the 911 operator answered, my voice came out trembling in a fearful whisper. "There's someone inside the house." I quickly explained the situation while keeping my eyes locked on the door, waiting for the doorknob to move again. The operator stayed calm and told me to stay where I was, keep the door locked, and be quiet. They were sending a unit immediately. The call only lasted a few minutes, but it felt like hours. I was still glued to the door, holding my breath, listening to the suffocating silence outside. The thing that was there had stopped. No more whispers, no more footsteps. But I knew it was still there. Then, out of nowhere, I heard another sound that made my stomach churn. The back door slowly opening. My skin crawled. Someone was leaving the house. I didn't dare open the bedroom door to see. I just stayed there, frozen, listening to the sound of footsteps walking away through the yard. Slow steps. as if the person, or whatever it was, knew I was listening. After a few minutes of complete silence, I heard the sirens of the police unit in the distance. Only then did I have the courage to unlock the door. I slowly left the bedroom, the cat still glued to my ankle. The kitchen was as I had left it, the living room too. But when I reached the back door, my blood ran cold. It was wide open, and outside on the damp cement floor, there were wet footprints leading away from the house. The police did a full sweep of the property but found nothing. No forced doors, no broken windows. The only thing that didn't make sense were the footprints. They started in the middle of the kitchen and went out to the yard, as if someone had appeared inside the house and then simply left. The next day, I packed my bags and left before dark. I never told my coworker exactly what happened. I just said the house was noisy. To this day, I can't explain what happened. But one thing I know, when a house seems empty, it doesn't always mean it is. Story 9. This happened a few months ago, on one of those ordinary days you never imagine would end in a nightmare. I had just left work and decided to stop by the supermarket before heading home. It was a Tuesday night, and the supermarket near my apartment in Orlando was practically empty. I like shopping at this time because it's quieter, no lines, no crowds. I grabbed a cart and started my usual route, first going through the produce section before heading to the frozen foods. Everything was normal until I noticed something strange. A man was standing at the end of the aisle, tall, thin, wearing a black hoodie with the hood pulled over his face. At first, I didn't pay much attention. There are strange people everywhere, but the way he was standing bothered me. He wasn't looking at the shelves, wasn't holding any products. He was just standing there, motionless, facing my direction. I pretended I hadn't noticed and kept walking, picking up a few things and heading to the next aisle. But when I got to the dairy section, my stomach churned. He was there again. This time, I paid more attention. He wasn't picking anything up, wasn't looking at the products. He was just standing there, as before, facing my direction. The supermarket was practically empty, and the absence of other customers made everything feel stranger, more wrong. I grabbed a yogurt without even looking at the flavor and kept walking, trying to ignore it. But in every aisle I entered, he was there. Always. Standing at the end of the aisle, watching me. My heart started to race. Was I overreacting? Maybe he was just shopping at the same pace as me. I tried to calm down, but a part of my brain was already screaming that this wasn't normal. I decided to test it. I grabbed a package of cheese, pretended to read the label, and then, without warning, took a step back and turned into the next aisle without looking. My plan was simple. I'd take an unexpected route and see if he would still appear. Walked quickly to the bakery section and turned my back to the shelves, pretending to chew some bread. My chest was rising and falling quickly. If he appeared there, it wouldn't be a coincidence. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to act normal, but my mind was racing. I held the bread package without even registering what it was, just to seem occupied. Then I felt it, that sensation of being watched. My heart tightened. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I slowly raised my eyes and scanned the store, trying to be discreet. And there he was, at the end of the bakery section. There was no way he could have just appeared there without following me. This wasn't a coincidence. He was following me. He wanted me to notice. The terror surged up my throat like a tight knot. I needed to get out of there, but at the same time, I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of showing fear. So I did the only thing I could think of. I took a deep breath, adjusted the cart, and walked to the checkout as if nothing was happening. But when I got close, I realized something that made my stomach drop. He was also heading for the checkout. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. If I went to the checkout and he stopped behind me in line, I'd be vulnerable. I didn't want to turn my back on him. I looked around, searching for an employee, someone who might notice the strange situation. But the store was almost empty. Just me, him, and one bored cashier at the register. Then I did something impulsive. Instead of going straight to the register, I pretended I had forgotten something and turned into an aisle. I stopped near the drink section, trying to think. If he followed me now, I would be sure it wasn't paranoia. My skin tingled. The silence in the store felt even heavier. Then I felt movement out of the corner of my eye. I looked through the reflection in the glass door of the refrigerator and saw the man standing at the entrance of the aisle, staring directly at me. My whole body froze. He wasn't picking anything up, wasn't pretending to buy anything. He was just standing there watching me. The cold light of the store made his silhouette seem even more distorted in the reflection of the glass. My mind screamed that I had to do something. If I didn't take control of the situation now, he would take control for me. I took a deep breath, trying not to show panic, and did something that might have been stupid, but was the only thing that came to mind. I looked directly at him. I stared into his eyes, or at least the dark shadow where they should have been under the hood. I made sure to show that I knew he was there. For a second, he stood still. Then, slowly, he took a step back and disappeared into the next aisle. I felt a momentary relief, but it quickly turned into even greater terror. Where did he go? The store was small, and it didn't make sense for him to just disappear. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding, trying to decide if I should run to the checkout and get out of there or wait to see if he reappeared. But the truth was, I already knew the answer. He hadn't given up. I grabbed my phone and opened the front camera to see if I could catch him without turning my face. I moved the phone slowly as if I were just scrolling through messages and pointed it at the aisle behind me. My blood ran cold. He was there, standing at the entrance of the aisle, watching me again. How had he moved so quickly? And worse, he was smiling. My breath caught in my throat. He knew I was trying to catch him in the act. And still, he was there, standing, smiling. The kind of smile that doesn't show friendliness, but something much worse. Amusement. Like he was playing with me. My hand trembled holding the phone, but I couldn't stay there any longer. Without thinking twice, I turned on my heels and walked quickly to the checkout. I didn't run, because running would mean panic. But my heart was pounding. The cashier looked at me without interest as I placed my items on the conveyor belt. My mouth was dry, and all I wanted was to get out of that place. But what if he was waiting outside? My stomach turned. The sound of the scanner passing the items never felt so slow. I grabbed my card and with trembling hands swiped it. It was then that the cashier looked past me and frowned. "You came with someone?" My body froze. I knew the answer before I even turned. Slowly, I looked through the reflection on the checkout screen. He was standing right behind me. I don't remember exactly what happened next. I only know that I left as fast as I could, even leaving some items behind. When I reached my car, I locked the doors and sat there, gasping, trying to calm down. I looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him leave the store, but he never did. I never returned to that supermarket. I never understood what he wanted. But since that night, every time I enter a public place, I make sure to look around, because I never want to feel that gaze again. Story 10. I've never been the paranoid type. I always considered myself a practical person, someone who locks the door before sleeping, but doesn't waste time worrying about impossible things. Until that night. Until I received that call. It was a Friday, just after midnight. I had just arrived home from work and only wanted to relax. My routine was always the same. I took a quick shower, made a snack, and watched something until sleep came. My only company was the silence and the bluish light of the TV flickering in the living room. Then my phone rang. I looked at the screen and frowned. Unknown number. Normally, I would have ignored it, but for some reason, I answered. Hello? At first, I didn't hear anything. Just static silence, as if the call had bad reception. But then a whisper came from the other side. Low, dragged, almost intimate. You left the window open. My body froze. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. I never left the window open at night. My heart started pounding. And without thinking, I glanced to the side. The dim light from the TV illuminated part of the living room. And for a moment, everything seemed normal. But then, as my gaze turned to the window, I felt the fear rise in my throat. The curtain was moving slightly, swaying as if a gentle breeze had passed through it. The problem? The window was closed. My mind tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe I had forgotten to lock it properly. Maybe there was a gap where the wind could pass. But who was? On the other side of the line? I swallowed hard, and with a trembling hand, I put the phone back to my ear. Who is this? My voice came out weaker than I wanted. The silence lasted far too long. Then, the whisper returned. "You should check now." A shiver ran down my spine. My fingers gripped the phone tightly. My whole body was screaming for me not to move, not to look, but at the same time, I felt that if I didn't do something, whatever was there would act first. My hands were sweating. The phone was still pressed against my ear, but now the line was silent. No breathing, no background noise. Just silence. The only thing moving in the apartment was the curtain, swaying slightly, even though the window was shut. My heart was beating so fast it hurt in my chest. I took a deep breath and slowly stood up, every muscle in my body tense. If I looked at the window and saw something there, what would I do? My mind tried to ignore the question as my feet moved almost against my will. With each step, the room felt colder, as if the air itself had changed. And then finally I got close enough to see the glass. My chest tightened. The glass reflected the dim light from the TV, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. Nothing but my own reflection and the darkness outside. But then, as my gaze moved across the smooth surface of the window, I noticed a detail that made my blood run cold. There was another shadow reflected beside mine. My breath faltered. My body went rigid, unable to react. There was no one else in the apartment. My reflection was still there, pale and still, but the other silhouette was moving, slowly, almost as if waiting for me to notice. My mind screamed for me to run, but my body refused to obey. It was then that the whisper returned, this time right behind me. "Don't turn." I felt the air behind me change, a cold, damp heaviness, as if something was standing there, so close that I could feel its presence, even without seeing it. My whole body trembled. The voice, that distorted whisper, didn't come from the phone. It came from inside my apartment. My eyes were still fixed on the glass, on the reflection of the shadow beside me. But now, it was closer, leaning in my direction. My instinct screamed for me to run, but at the same time an irrational fear told me that if I moved, it would move too. I couldn't turn. I couldn't run. All I could do was stand there frozen, waiting, and praying that it wouldn't touch me first. I don't know how long I stood there. Maybe seconds, maybe minutes. My own reflection seemed distorted by terror. My eyes wide, my face pale. The thing beside me was still there, leaning, watching me. Then, in a slow, dragging motion, it lifted a hand. My heart almost stopped. The dark, elongated hand touched the glass. The touch was so subtle that it made no sound, but I saw it. I saw the fingers pressing against the cold glass, as if it were testing something, as if it were trying to feel if the barrier was real. That's when I did the only thing I could do. I closed my eyes. My chest rose and fell in short, rapid breaths. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But all I did was force myself to stay still. My mind screamed that if I ignored it, if I pretended I had never seen it, maybe, just maybe, it would leave. Then, seconds later, I felt something change. The weight in the air lifted. The cold behind me disappeared. My body relaxed. When I opened my eyes again, the reflection beside me was no longer there. The only shadow in the window was mine. I never found out who called me that night. I never knew if it had been there before I answered or if it came after. But now I know one thing. If you ever receive a strange call late at night and a voice whispers something about your house, don't look, don't answer, just hang up.